It's my pleasure to introduce Liora Halperin, who will be speaking on the birth and evolution of Zionism. Liora is an assistant professor of history at the University of Colorado, Boulder, and a core faculty member in Jewish studies. Her research focuses on Jewish cultural history, Jewish-Palestinian relations, language, ideology, and policy, and the politics surrounding nation formation in Palestine in the years leading up to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. She has an upcoming book coming out next month with Yale University Press called Babel and Zion, Jews, Nationalism, and Language Diversity in Palestine, 1920 to 1948. Liora received her PhD from UCLA. She has worked at Princeton University and held other visiting affiliations at UC Berkeley, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and Harvard. So please join me in welcoming Liora.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and it's been great to talk to some of you, and I'm looking forward to our conversations as the day goes on. My presentation, as you can tell from its title, focuses on Jewish history and Jewish politics and thought. I'm leaving it to my colleagues to complement the picture that I'm giving you with perspectives from other parts of the Middle East, from the imperial powers, and from the Palestinians. And I hope that by the end of the day, you, on the one hand, find that you're having trouble reconciling all the perspectives you've heard, but that struggling to do so is a way that you can really be very honest with yourself and with your students about the kinds of approaches you might take to this history. I should also say that in this presentation, I'll be focusing on mostly the evolution of Zionism before 1948. But if you're interested in the way that this conversation continues, even to this day, I'm happy to have that conversation as time goes on. So the first thing we need to start with is the fact that the story of Zionism is a transnational story. Zionism was a key factor in shaping the development of Palestine, of course, but it's a movement that originated in and developed from events in Europe. And it changed and developed as it moved from Europe to becoming a settlement and nation-building project in Palestine. So that means, for at least the context of my presentation, we need to step outside the context of the Middle East in order to understand a force that ultimately shaped the Middle East. So what am I going to talk about today? I want to start by giving you an overview of the Jewish world at the time so we can kind of understand the backdrop. I'll then zoom in on the conditions going on in Western and Central and Eastern Europe that eventually would give rise to the Zionist movement. After doing that, I'll start talking about evolution and the way that Zionism changed over time, evolving as a product of different kinds of debates, and also as a product over time of encounters in Palestine with the British as well as with Palestinian Arabs. Very briefly, because others are going to cover this, I'll be interested in how late Ottoman and British imperial trends influenced and enabled the movement's growth in Palestine. And as we go through, I'll also make sure to talk about how a group of originally European Jews, as they settled in the Middle East, had to come to terms with the increasingly evident and unmistakable local Palestinian opposition to their project. Right, and how did that change the Zionist movement? And as we go along, I'll be showing you a few sources, and I'll flag them. These might be the kinds of sources you might bring to your classrooms when you take this back home. So first, what do I mean when I say we're talking about Zionism? So there's a few starting points so that we're all on the same page. Zionism is a movement of the late 19th century. That's where it began. It begins with the claim that Jews are a national group and not only a religious group. There would be many others who would say, well, Jews, that's a religion, obviously. That's not a nation. But Zionists would say Jews are a national group. The second inference that they made from that is that Jews should be recognized as a nation and be given political rights or national autonomy or sovereignty, depending on the version of Zionism, on the basis of this national status. And finally, the real kicker with Zionism was that the location that this sovereignty or autonomy should happen, they believed, was Palestine. Jews would call it traditionally the land of Israel, and Zion in Zionism comes from a biblical term for Jerusalem. Now you see I put an asterisk there, that's not a typo. That's to indicate that in fact this third premise, that the place should be Palestine, was not evident from the very beginnings. That emerged fairly strongly, fairly quickly, but at the very beginning, really only those first two principles were the principles that defined Zionism. So I promised you we're talking about Zionism, but I think it's really helpful, especially since I know many of you are teachers of world history or global studies, to think about the global picture of where Jews are in the world once we get to the 19th century. So I have some terms up here that some of you may be familiar with, some subgroupings of Jews. Many of you know that Jews as a people or as a religion originated in Palestine, in fact in ancient Canaan, but had begun to migrate outwards already in ancient times. Sometimes they were expelled, sometimes they migrated for economic reasons, as far back as the period of the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And they migrated quite far, especially during the period of the Roman Empire. Jews started migrating across North Africa, and particularly significant for us, up into Europe, particularly into the area of Germany and France. And it's those Jews who migrated already in the Middle Ages up to the region of Germany and France, those Jews are called Ashkenazi Jews. They're particularly known for speaking this very interesting dialect of German influenced by Hebrew and written in Hebrew letters called Yiddish. So Ashkenazi Jews started in the region of Germany, but many of them moved east over the course of the Middle Ages and early modern period. There's a lot of religious conflict in Western Europe, and they found, in fact, that the regions of Poland at that time and Lithuania were a much more friendly place for them. This is how we see Ashkenazi Jews moving east into what later became the Russian Empire. But not all Jews migrated to Europe. When the Middle East came under the rule of Islam in the 600s, Jews migrated across the Muslim world. Many of them migrated to Spain, which became a very important center of Jewish culture and Jewish thought. And they retained their identity as Spanish Jews. The word Sephardic actually literally means Spanish, even after they were expelled in 1492. And many of those Sephardi Jews moved on to the Ottoman Empire, to Turkey and Greece and the Balkans. So already we're thinking about the way the Jews are expanding and spreading across the world. Well, what happened to Palestine? A very small population of Jews remained in Palestine through that Roman, Byzantine, Muslim period, but their numbers grew slightly after the Spanish expulsion. So we have some Sephardi Jews joining these Eastern or Mizrahi Jews after 1492. And then as we move into the 1800s and 1900s, the 1700s and 1800s, they're being joined also by some Ashkenazi Jews who are migrating to Palestine, to the Holy Land, mainly for religious reasons. They see it literally as a holy land where they want to live, or in some cases where they want to die and be buried. Back in Europe, though, and we're going to be focusing a lot on Europe, this is a map of where Jews were most concentrated come the late 19th century. And you can see that that real concentration is in those eastern regions of Europe, part of the Russian Empire. In fact, when Poland, which had an enormous population of Jews, came under Russian rule in the 1790s, Catherine the Great decided to set up this western borderland of Russia as a particular region in which Jews were limited to, right? Jews had to live in these regions. And that was a way for her, actually, of populating this newly conquered territory. By the time we get to the 19th century, this area, which came to be called the Pale of Settlement, was the area of the highest concentration of Jews anywhere in the world. We're talking up to 15 or 17% of the population was Jewish, a very significant population. And it's in this area that Zionism is going to begin. This was a place where most Jews were religious, but they were increasingly being influenced by the idea of learning secular sciences, even while they maintained their Jewish cultural identity. This is kind of our map here. But we don't want to forget that there also were Jews that continued to live in the central and western parts of Europe, France, Germany, England, Austria. Some of them had come earlier, some actually had migrated from Eastern Europe for economic or for educational reasons. So if we're going to understand the emergence of Zionism, we need to look at trends going on in multiple places. This is what makes Zionism such an interesting story. We need to look at what's going on in Eastern Europe, primarily the Russian Empire. And we also need to look at trends in Western and Central Europe, and especially some trends going on in Germany and Austria. So here's the Pale of Settlement. You can see those borders. In fact, if you yourself are Jewish or you know someone who's Jewish in the US and they say, I'm from Russia or I'm from Eastern Europe, chances are that their ancestors came from this particular region. What happens in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s? We see an enormous ferment of political thought. And we'll want to think about just what happens to bring about this new political thinking. So a few things happen, and I apologize for that small font at the bottom. I think some formatting got messed up in the transmission process. But there's a few things that happen in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, starting already in the 1790s and especially in the early 1800s, the empire, the Russian Empire, starts to centralize. The state does not give citizenship. We're still talking about subjects under an imperial rule. The state starts to centralize. They start to expand their power out to those peripheries. Part of centralization is integration of minorities into the center. And Jews benefited from, or at least were very much affected from, by these policies of integration. Jews started learning Russian. They started studying in Russian universities. They started studying secular sciences. And what emerges, in part because of this centralization by the state, is a new group of Jews. They refer to themselves as enlightened Jews, or maskilim, and they're engaged in a process of modernization, of trying to take Jews who have been quite traditional and often quite insular, and trying to push them and bring them into the modern world that they're living in. But what's very interesting about Eastern Europe is that, for the most part, Jews who were being integrated into these modern movements remained very much committed to Jewish culture. This would be different in Western Europe, which is why I'm flagging it. And many of them, in forming their identity as modern people, turned to specifically Jewish languages as part of their modern identity. So some of them turned to Yiddish and wrote modern literature in Yiddish. And some of them started turning to Hebrew and expressing their modern Jewish identity in Hebrew. So this is all going along, but these movements of modernization end up stalling or coming into conflict with the surrounding country and culture, particularly come 1882. And in 1882, an event happens. The Tsar, Alexander II, is assassinated. In part, there were Jews involved with the scheming around this, although they were not the only ones. And there was a huge wave of anti-Semitic pogroms or anti-Jewish riots that break out at that point. And that leads some Jews looking on, committed to being modern, committed to being Jewish, but very concerned about this new anti-Semitism, to make a turn, to make a political turn to Jewish nationalism. But what's interesting about Eastern Europe, and we'll come back to this in a second, is that they turn to a particularly ethnic and linguistic-based nationalism, right? It's nationalism about being Jewish as an ethnicity. And that doesn't come out of nowhere. This is the kind of nationalism that is becoming very common in the Russian Empire in general. Lots of groups are becoming linguistic nationalists or ethnic nationalists in this period. So what's a source we might want to look at to understand some of this turn to nationalism? So the classic source is written by Leon Pinsker in 1882. You might look at that date and say, that was before Theodor Herzl, and you would be right. This comes before Theodor Herzl. Leon Pinsker, who's an ophthalmologist living in Odessa, says that it is time to move from a state of being downtrodden by anti-Semitism to a state in which he says, we Jews should emancipate ourselves, right? We can't wait for someone else to do it. He says we must first of all desire to help ourselves, and then the help of others is sure to follow. And we'll come back in a little bit to the fact that in the wake of Pinsker, the first waves of Jews start migrating to Palestine and setting up their own agricultural communities. Meanwhile, back in Western and Central Europe, what is going on there? In some ways, the story of Enlightenment and modernization begins even earlier than in Eastern Europe. Already in the 1780s and 1790s, Jews, as well as their Christian compatriots, are beginning a conversation about the integration of Jews into their societies. This occurs in a very formal way in France with the French Revolution, and in a much more halting, informal way in Germany and in Austria, or Prussia at that time. What did the Enlightenment mean in Germany? It meant the belief in individual rights. It meant the belief in citizenship. And Jews were a very important test case. If they, who were such an unusual and unique group from the perspective of European Christians, if they could be enlightened and integrated, then the very principle of enlightenment would be supported. Like that is the mark of success. But at the same time, and here we get to the second box going down here, the questions emerged from Christians as well as, in fact, some Jews at the time. Is it really possible for Jews to be integrated? Is there something about them that makes it impossible for them to be truly a part of their national society, to participate as citizens the same way as non-Jews? This question about the possibility of Jewish integration came to be called the Jewish question. Right? So long before Adolf Hitler would use that term in a very different way, Jews themselves, as well as some non-Jews, were using this term to talk about this problem of integration. But in part because Jews were being integrated, because they were losing some of their distinctive qualities, and also in part because of some economic pressures and crises that take hold in Germany and Austria, a wave of anti-Semitism emerges. A very, very particular modern phenomenon that look at Jews not as a religion, but as a race of people who are fundamentally Jews, even if they convert. Some Jews respond to this anti-Semitism by saying, we just need to try harder. Integration is obviously the right answer, and we just need to be patient and work with the people around us to allow that to happen. Others, though, and it's a very small number at first, say no. Jews cannot be a part of the nations in which they live. In fact, they constitute a different nation. And the most famous person to say this, and he's not the only one, but he's the name that most people know, and he's particularly important, is Theodor Herzl, born in Budapest, moves to Vienna, becomes a correspondent for a Jewish newspaper. He eventually goes to France as a journalist. He covers the Dreyfus affair. Already he was becoming concerned about this question of Jewish integration, but something about this accusation of treason in this enlightened nation of France and the anti-Semitism that emerged in its wake made him particularly worried. And he wrote in his famous book, The Jewish State, whenever I say source, that's a source that you might want to turn to and look at with your students. He says that it doesn't matter where Jews are and how successful they are. Everywhere they go, they're going to be regarded as outsiders. And so he says later in the document, here's the solution that I suggest. Let some sovereignty be granted to us somewhere. And in fact, you should note, there's my asterisk from before. He does not specify that it had to be Palestine. And we'll be able to manage for ourselves. This will be the solution for the Jewish question. That's actually the subtitle of the book, The Jewish State, a modern solution to the Jewish question. He calls together 1 year later, 1897, the first Zionist Congress. There's a picture of it in Basel, Switzerland. He brings together delegates from around Europe to think in a practical way about just how to take this idea and put it into action. So this is the combination of trends that spawn Zionism. You have disenchantment with liberalism and enlightenment in Western Europe, combined with political violence and upheaval in Eastern Europe. And this is, what?
I think you meant to switch.
No, I didn't mean to switch it yet. And this is all occurring in Eastern Europe alongside an already growing Jewish cultural nationalism, a sense that Jewish identity is already based in things like culture and language. So it's a kind of a fertile ground in Eastern Europe. Before I go on and talk about the development of Zionism, it's very important to note that at this stage in the 1890s, early 1900s, there is an enormous amount of opposition to Zionism, an enormous amount of opposition. This is PowerPoint doing this funny font thing. I'm sorry about that. Opposition is coming from literally every direction, because as I said, only a very small number of people, of Jews, are Zionists. And these are four groups that are very interesting to think about. On the one hand, you have Orthodox Jews, Jews who have not been such a big fan of these enlightening trends. And they look at Zionism and they say, that is absolute heresy. God has communicated to us that Jews will return to the Holy Land at the end of days, in Messianic times. And for a bunch of secular Jews to go and have the gall to suggest that they should move and do this on their own is absolutely counter to the will of God. Meanwhile, you have liberal Jews, and this is particularly true in countries like France and England, who think that Zionism and its claim that integration is impossible, that very claim is going to threaten Jewish progress towards integration. What if the non-Jews around them actually come to believe that the Zionists are right and stop working as they are to integrate Jews? Enormous amount of liberal opposition. There are great primary sources on all of these if you're interested. In Eastern Europe, you also see opposition from a group called autonomists. Autonomists are people who do believe that Jews are a nation. They would agree with that number one on my three definitions. They would even agree with number two, that Jews should have national rights. But they think the idea of moving to somewhere else, and especially Palestine, is just nonsense, that it'll never happen and is ridiculous. So they are demanding Jewish rights of education, language, etc., right where they are, right there in the Russian Empire. And finally, also primarily in Eastern Europe, you have a group of socialist Jews. So socialists look at Zionism and they say, nationalism is a bourgeois development, terrible, comes with all sorts of oppression. We certainly can't support Zionism, right? So we have to keep this in mind, that all of these groups are opposing what these upstarts in Eastern and Western Europe are doing. All right, so we want to talk about the evolution of Zionism. Right? What happens after these big ideas from guys in different parts of Europe? How does it change and develop? So Zionism begins really as an answer to a European set of questions. Many people in Europe came to be Zionists not because they necessarily intended to move themselves, but because they thought it was a logical way of asserting Jewish national identity. And I say Europe, but this also comes to be true in America and other parts of the world. Zionism develops, though, into a settlement project, a nation-building project to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And what is so interesting and so important to keep in mind is that both of these two things are going on at the same time. So even as the settlement project is going on, you still see Zionism operating as an identity marker abroad. And one might say that it is even true to this day that there are Jews who might say that they are Zionists, but really they have no personal interest in the land-based project, but for them it's some piece of asserting their own identity as Jews. So how does the Zionist movement develop over time? I want to take you through a few different periods here. So I mentioned 1882, Pinsker writes his treatise, Auto-Emancipation, and the first small groups of Jews come to Palestine. They're a group called the Lovers of Zion. Here's a map of some of the early colonies. This is actually through 1914. Most of the very earliest are in the region of Jaffa, and some of them are up further along the coast near Haifa. These colonies turn out to be agricultural failures, and they would have gone completely belly up were it not for the support that comes in from French Jewish philanthropists, most notably the Rothschild family, had their French and their British sides. The first Aliyah, here, the first Aliyah is in, like I said, a very small group. Half of them leave. There's only 35,000 or so to begin with. Half of them leave because things are just not working out for them. They buy up tracts of land, and for the most part, they grow grapes or they grow wheat. In some cases, they grow citrus, and they hire local Palestinian Arabs to do the work. Right? They're not doing the work. So in some ways, these are very typical colonies. And you notice I'm using the word colonies. They themselves use the word colonies. This term was very much in use during this period. So this wave of immigration, called an aliyah, each of these waves came to be called aliyot, which actually means ascent. It's a very loaded term. This was the first wave of immigration. Interesting interestingly enough, a lot of the Central European Jews over there with their Zionist congresses are very much supporting this settlement, but for the time being, none of them personally intended to move. They thought this is an issue for those terrible, beleaguered Eastern European Jews, and for now, we'll just support them from a distance. The first Aliyah gives way to what's called the second Aliyah. So while Central European and some Western European Jews are still providing the organizational backbone of this tiny Jewish settlement movement, there are ongoing tensions in the Russian Empire. There's the Kishinev pogrom in 1903, which was a real shock, drove further waves of Jews from that region to Palestine. These folks, though, were different than their friends from the Pale of Settlement who had come earlier. A lot of them were influenced by the growing socialist trends of early 20th century Russia. These trends emphasized the value of labor, the romantic attachment to the soil. And these socialists, who retained a lot of their socialist values even while taking up the nationalist ideas of Zionism, they were very concerned about the fact that these first Aliyah Jews were just sitting there owning land while hiring, and in their view, exploiting these local Palestinian Arab workers. They were convinced that this path was bad for Jews, both because they were not becoming properly connected to the soil and because they were seen as exploitative. So what did they do? They pushed for what they called the conquest of labor. Again, I'm sorry for the formatting. The conquest of labor, that is, take back the labor. Do all the labor as Jews. Separate the Jewish market from the Palestinian Arab market. In some cases, create socialist agricultural collectives that'll really put into practice some of these utopian ideals. This move by the members of the Second Aliyah is a really interesting one because it's based in what, in their view, is really enlightened values. For them, they think equality and elimination of exploitation is the best thing they could possibly do. On the other hand, at the same time, this model of a separate economy pretty much eliminated Palestinian Arabs from the economic picture. Arabs are no longer essential as workers. In fact, they think it's a bad idea to hire them. So the Zionist movement at this stage starts imagining a more fully Jewish project, a project in which all the roles are going to be taken by Jews. They had a vision of really starting from scratch to create an all-Jewish model society. And for those of you who teach American history, it's really interesting to compare this mindset to that of American colonists who imagined creating their own kind of model society or a city on a hill that would take shape without very much direct engagement with the Native American population. I think that kind of comparison, although there are many differences, is actually a very interesting one for thinking about this period of Zionism. So the second Aliyah and the third Aliyah that followed, which shared many of these values, was not only about economic principles, although that was a very important part of who they were. They also were advocates of something that came to be known as cultural Zionism. So I mentioned before that Eastern European Zionism emerged from trends of linguistic and ethnic nationalism. Some of their predecessors were promoting Hebrew and Yiddish as tools of modernization. Theodor Herzl was a German speaker. He really didn't know Hebrew. He convened the conventions of Zionists in German. But many of these Eastern European Zionists, especially those who came to Palestine, were already working to raise up Hebrew as the national language. Another fascinating story to look at. So why Hebrew? Well, Hebrew was the language of the Hebrew Bible. It was the period that they saw the language of the period of Jewish autonomy in the ancient Holy Land. These Zionists thought that promoting Hebrew would be a really direct and visceral way to tie Jews back to their national existence. They thought that Hebrew could symbolize a prouder and stronger and more physically robust existence. And many of them rejected Yiddish, even if it was their mother tongue, because they saw it as the language of oppression, of backwardness, of weakness. So in the early decades of the 20th century, advocates of Hebrew were building up institutions. They were building preschools and elementary schools and university-level classes. They translated literature into Hebrew. They put lots of social pressure on immigrants who did not want to leave their mother tongues and adopt Hebrew. Through this labor idea, came to be called labor Zionism, and this cultural idea, the second and third aliyot, these two waves of immigration, right before and right after World War I, ended up creating the kind of national hegemony of Zionism during this period. Those ideas became dominant ideas, even well into the Mandate period. I just want to mention one other group of Zionists that's really interesting, just very briefly. So I mentioned that Zionism was mostly a secular movement, and that most Orthodox Jews thought this was absolute heresy. But in fact, over time, a very small group of Orthodox Jews found a way to reconcile Orthodoxy with Zionism. And they did that by saying, yes, the ultimate aim is for God to act and bring the Messiah, but they came to believe that human active settlement now in Palestine would be the first step towards the coming of the Messiah. It's a very interesting kind of theology that enables them to say that. So I mention this not because it was very important during these early years, but because after 1967, when Israel conquers these very biblically and religiously important areas in Jerusalem and the West Bank, it becomes much more of a political force. So I've mentioned a lot about internal Jewish political ideological developments. But it's very important to note, and I'll do this briefly because this is the topic of some other people's presentations, that none of this would have really borne fruit were it not for bigger conditions that are allowing them to physically get to Palestine and purchase lands there. And just a very few things to mention here. So it's both Ottoman and British developments that allow this. The Ottomans, trying to centralize and get some more investment as they feel like they're going through economically hard times, they passed reforms at several points in the 19th century called the Tanzimat. One of those allows Europeans to essentially come freely to the Ottoman Empire, Palestine's part of the Ottoman Empire at that time, and set up businesses. In some cases, if they were Christian, to set up churches and missionary institutions. This is how, in a very basic level, Zionists, as Europeans, holding their European papers, were able to physically get there, rather than be turned away at the border. Sorry, no luck, you gotta go back to where you came from. At the same time, the Ottomans passed land reforms that, in order to collect more taxes, ended up forcing small peasants or small landowners to sell their ownings, often to larger landowners, often owners who did not live in the place where the land was located. And it's this concentration of lands in the hands of people who didn't always live on the land that created the conditions for the sale of that land to Zionists later. So really important to remember that it's not just ideology that creates reality, it's also structural conditions that make things possible. The same is true of the British. We talked about this before, and we'll talk about it again, that it's imperial ambitions of a variety of kinds that lead them to have a fairly open and receptive position towards Zionism. And those ambitions lead to the Balfour Declaration. It was mentioned before, this is the text of it, this is the statement, it's very, very vague, in some ways it's extremely ambiguous. It makes a statement that the British government looks favorably on the establishment of a national home for Jews in Palestine. And some of that language gets worked into the language of the Mandate itself. The Mandate period becomes a time of enormous institutional and cultural developments for Zionists in Palestine. There's the growth of Tel Aviv occurs during this period with its iconic Bauhaus architecture brought over by German immigrants. The foundation of the Hebrew University, that's the second picture, occurs in 1925. Also the creation of some of the proto-state institutions that are going to prove very, very useful once statehood is on the threshold, including the Haganah, the proto-military or the main proto-military organization of Zionists in Mandate Palestine. I told you I wanted to talk about the issue of how to relate to Arab opposition. Right? This was an enormous question because it became increasingly clear that the locals were not receptive to Zionists coming in large numbers and buying up land. There's an interesting progression that occurs. Early on, in the time of Pinsker and Herzl, for the most part, they simply were not thinking about it. It just doesn't come up, or it comes up very, very little. With the first Aliyah, there's this assumption that, well, we're going to create jobs. That'll be good. People will be happy. No problem. It's all going to be fine. Labor Zionists say, no, we're going to separate our economies. They'll do their own thing, and Jews will do their own thing, and that'll also work out fine. There's kind of sense that it's going to be okay. Like, there's not really a problem. By the 1920s, though, a more serious dispute is emerging among Zionists about how to respond to just evident local rejection of this entire project. And these two streams of Zionism, which really come to a head with each other in the 20s, into the 30s, and even further, is going to be very definitive, decisive for Jews. Let me just turn here. So we have our labor Zionists. They believed that what Zionism was doing was a good thing. It just simply was a good thing for the land and its inhabitants, and that for a constellation of reasons, the Palestinian Arabs are not understanding that. But they didn't believe this was a fundamental conflict. They believed that through good communication, through explanation of the project, those local Palestinian Arabs could be convinced. But a new group of Zionists, who were known as revisionists, Zionist right-wingers, they opposed this entire worldview. They were much more staunch in being not conciliatory towards the British. They were more willing to use military tactics as time went on. Their leader, Vladimir Jabotinsky, another source fascinating to look at, said that conflict is inevitable. It is simply a natural outgrowth of a group of people from one place coming to another place and upsetting the balance. And there was nothing that they could do about it except prepare for it, prepare for confrontation, and because they believed they were morally in the right, to win that confrontation. This belief in the inevitability of conflict and the justness of using force to win if necessary also has its ripples in contemporary Israeli politics. You can actually see ripples of both of these ideologies in contemporary Israeli politics. So the way I was presenting Zionism in its early years, the first, second, third aliyot, was as an ideological position, right? That settling Palestine, considering Jews a nationality, was the right way to think about reality. But things started changing as we get into the late 20s and especially in the 1930s. Instead of Palestine being an ideological choice, Palestine becomes a practical choice. In the 1920s, a wave of about 80,000 immigrants from Poland come mainly for economic reasons. By that point, the US has mostly shut down immigration to the US. Palestine is their best or even only option. It's also true in what's called the fifth aliyah, the fifth wave of immigration. Over 200,000, really closer to 250,000 refugees from Germany and Austria are able to leave in the mid-1930s and come to Palestine. Not necessarily because they thought that Zionism was the best possible response, but because this is just, Palestine is the most practical place for them. So Zionism started as just one ideological response among many to questions about pathways to Jewish immigration. The events of World War II, especially the trauma of the Holocaust, placed Zionism on a different course. It was in this period that Western opinions started coalescing around the idea of a Jewish state. The Zionist leaders started advocating more directly that a state, an independence, was the only option because of this major refugee problem that the British were not succeeding in solving because they were not allowing immigration. So these political developments gave people who had been ideologically Zionist all along a very powerful sort of confirmation, in their view, that Zionism and all of its conclusions about the world was the only acceptable Jewish ideology. Like, look around you. Look, of course we were right all along. There's this just sense of being affirmed. So tragedy and crisis made an ideological choice seem like an ideological imperative. And this sense of Zionism as being the only possible Jewish response became dominant really around the world. Zionism becomes a very widespread Jewish ideology. And that sense that Zionism is sort of the way Jews think remained prominent well into the late 20th century, and some might say even until now among many Jews. But I want to just close, this is my last slide, by saying that if this seems to be a story about Zionism being contested to Zionism being not contested, it's not entirely true. In some ways, the questions that were being debated during the early years, 1880s, 1890s, remained, or even grew stronger as this nation-building movement merged with and eventually overlapped with the pro-Israel nation-building process after 1948. So certain questions are still being debated by many Jews. Can Jews truly integrate into the places where they live? If that place is America or Europe? Or on some level, are they always in danger of being rejected and in need of a safe haven? Another question, are Jews fundamentally a national group? Or, as many people would say, are they a religious group whose members can be part of, and maybe should be part of, many different nations? And then the question that liberals were saying early on, which is, does separating Jews out into a separate unit reduce anti-Semitism, as Herzl had thought, or does it increase anti-Semitism? And of course, the answers to these questions depend on time and place. Do they change as we think about different periods of Jewish history? These questions, which are, I might say, the quintessential modern Jewish questions, are very complex and they have multiple answers. And there are questions that we can ask with our students. We can discuss them and we can debate them as we think about the way Zionism fits into the whole overall Jewish historical experience. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I hope we have time for some questions.
We're going to get the mics out.
Hi, Dr. Halperin. My name is John Larkins, and I am a teacher from Virginia. I have a question for you a little more about what role did the large immigration to the United States of many European Jews play in this debate about Zionism? So was there any sort of uniquely American aspect of it? Most of your presentation seemed to say there was this sort of, dualistic debate within, East and Western Europe. Did that just mimic itself when, the Jewish migration began in the early 1900s to the United States?
Yeah.
Or was there some uniquely sort of American spin that happened when many Jews came to the United States and were influenced maybe or not by American culture?
Yeah, I definitely don't want to present what's going on in Europe as dualistic, right? In each of these settings, there are these multiple kinds of political interpretations. And the same is true in America. So about 2 million Jews come to America, mainly from the Russian Empire between the 1880s and 1924. There's a range of positions. Many of those Jews are strongly interested in integrating as best as possible into American society, assimilating, not standing out as Jews. Many of them initially were, just like French or British Jews, kind of nervous about this nationalist ideology that seemed to set Jews apart and claim that Jews couldn't be integrated. But at the same time, there emerges an American sort of Zionism that sees Zionism as this model liberal project, trying to establish a model democratic kind of society to a group of people who have been persecuted. They see something of the American story in that, of the Pilgrims, the Puritans coming and being persecuted and building this model democracy. So for many, there are people like Louis Brandeis would be an example, or Judah Magnus, who comes to be the head of the Hebrew University, see their Zionism and their American liberalism as very much consistent with each other. They didn't say, oh, these are two different things. They see them as being integrated with each other. So that's just a kind of brief answer to the question, some of the variety of views.
Hi, my name is Seth Freelander. I teach at Haddonfield High School right over the river. I have a question for you, a pedagogical question.
Yeah.
So teaching a 9th grade class that is mostly 20th century world history, and you want to introduce into Zionism, how far back would you go in history to start? You go into 70 CE? Are you going to biblical? I mean, where would you begin to have students understand that this is a response?
Yeah. Well, I think, kind of like I did in this presentation, I think it's very important to give them a sense of what does the Jewish world look like at the time. like how did it work out? The Jews that started in the Middle East ended up in Germany. Like that's kind of a logical leap that's useful to explain, but I wouldn't go very deeply into that. I think the story is a 19th century story. I think you would start talking about political trends in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. It's a story of enlightenment, which you might be teaching on a broader level in your European history classes, and you can think about Zionism as just one piece of that European discussion about modernization. That would be my answer to the question. Other people might disagree.
Hi, my name is Christina. I teach in New York. And my question is just somewhat of a factual one, and perhaps it's an error on my part, but you did mention that Palestine was not always the sole locale looked at for homeland, and I had heard that Argentina was a top contender, and I don't know why.
Yeah, so at the time that Zionism is emerging, this idea of establishing a Jewish territory, a Jewish autonomous territory, it's kind of taking off in all kinds of directions. There's actually a group called the Territorialists who kind of break off from the Zionists, and they say it doesn't matter if it's Palestine. It could be Argentina. They were looking in the Crimea, interestingly enough. There are all kinds of very odd proposals like Madagascar, like stuff that went absolutely nowhere. Why Argentina? Argentina was a very fertile and agriculturally promising land that didn't have a lot of population. So it was seen as a place that Jews could go. And in fact, these territorialists did send some groups of Jews to the Pampas in Argentina. And there's this really interesting history that I don't know a huge amount about of these Jewish cowboys going out on the Pampas and living the dream or whatever it was. So it's an interesting part of Latin American history also.
Hi, I'm Shar, and I teach in Bryn Mawr locally. So I'm wondering about making connections for my students, and you mentioned the Rothschilds and their philanthropic support. So when, during the time of slavery and post-slavery, there were Americans who supported resettlement. They didn't like slavery, but they also didn't want to have certain people around here. I just wonder, was that a movement as well that was happening at the time of Zionism?
You mean a movement by non-Jews who were
Yes.
excited about the idea of getting Jews out?
Yeah.
Well, this is what Herzl was banking on. He pretty much said it straight out. He said, the anti-Semites are going to love this idea, right? Like, we want to get out, they want us to get out. This is a marriage made in heaven. It was almost like a deal with the devil, right? To be like, hey, we're actually on the same page. Why don't we tell them that if they help us, we'll actually help them achieve this outcome. So yeah, that was part of the thinking. There wasn't exactly a movement of that sort, a non-Jewish movement, but it was a part of the early Zionist thinking. Sorry, I shouldn't be.
Hi, Adam Hosey, STEM Academy. Could you discuss a little bit more the conflict between the labor and revisionist Zionists? It seemed like a major turning point ideologically, and I guess who won, if there was a winner, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it was in some ways it was an economic difference. We have the socialist or social democratic principles of the labor Zionists versus the very strongly nationalistic, even a kind of militant nationalism of the revisionists. So that was one key difference. And then this answer to what sometimes got called the Arab question, almost paralleling or reflecting the Jewish question, was the other major issue on which they split. Right? Is this a problem that is just based on misunderstanding that can be worked out maybe through contact, maybe through some propaganda work, or is this a fundamental conflict that is simply not going to be resolved and needs to be won by force? Now, the answer to who won, well, certainly initially the labor Zionists won. They were in control of all the Zionist institutions, which were proto-state institutions under the British Mandate. And then when Israel comes into being in 1948, the labor Zionists also come into control of all the state institutions. But over time, for a variety of reasons that I probably can't get into, the labor Zionists lose their public approval. Partly there's immigration that comes in of Jews from the Arab world, these Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews that I mentioned before, who have different political goals and aims, and they want some change. In Jerusalem. I was going to say change in Washington, but they want to change in Jerusalem. And then the heirs of the right-wingers, the Likud party, what is now the Likud party, actually comes into power. And one might say that now, in fact, the heirs of the revisionists are relatively in more power than the heirs of the labor Zionists. That's kind of the way that Israeli politics has shifted, although there have been changes along the way in both of these political movements.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Husick, and I'm a senior fellow at FPRI. Can you speak a little bit about the economics of land purchase from the time of the first Aliyah until the closing of immigration during the Mandate? How much of Palestine was actually land purchased from the Palestinian Arabs by the immigrants, and what was the legitimacy of those transactions, and how were they viewed both by the buyers and the sellers?
Yeah, this is a great question. So first of all, it's important to note that the total lands purchased by Zionists before statehood was really quite small. I don't know the figure offhand, but it's under 10% of Palestine was actually purchased by Zionists. And there are maps that you can see. It tended to be particularly fertile areas, so that statistic is a little bit misleading, but it still was very, very little. Those lands were purchased through mechanisms of sale that existed. Now, part of the problem is that the Turkish land records were often very unclear. Boundaries were often not marked. The person living on the land was often not the person who owned the land for the reasons I described. So by and large, the purchases occurred according to the regulations at the time, right? They were not simply conquered in that period. But the folks living on the land, who were often peasants, who were allowed to keep working even as the owners changed, they did not approve of this, and so therefore, as far as they were concerned, it was absolutely inappropriate. It was absolutely illegal in their view. There were all kinds of disputes. Some of them actually went to the courts, both under the Ottomans and then under the British, in which, this boundary, it's not this tree, it's that tree. I can graze my cow. No, you can't graze your cow. Like these really nitty-gritty kinds of things were really creating a lot of tension on the ground. But it was, mostly by law.
Sally Gallagher from Villanova area. Where do you, and I would be interested for my colleagues to hear, the religious aspect of anti-Semitism and the expulsion, especially the Catholic Church. I teach in a Catholic institution, and I do teach this subject. But it's always a very delicate, not a delicate subject. I believe it's a real subject.
Yeah.
But do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so one thing that's important to stress to your students is the distinction between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. So anti-Judaism can date it very, very far back, kind of religiously based opposition to Jews and Judaism. In the Christian case, it was based on the idea that Jews were fundamentally in error theologically, that they had chosen the wrong path. In Christian view, that they had killed Christ. That Jews needed to be kept in this lowly sort of state. So if you look at medieval anti-Jewish violence, it's based in these religious ideas of Jews just being on the wrong course, religiously speaking. So when I talked about Jews being expelled from Germany and France eastward, that's anti-Judaism that's leading to that. What happens in the modern period, and particularly in the 19th century, is anti-Semitism. And the term it's important to stress. Anti-Semitism is based on this word Semite, which is this kind of ethnic designation that identifies Jews not as a religion, but rather as a race. This is part of this European and particularly German racial thinking that's emerging at that time, in which everyone's part of a race, and your race is fundamental to who you are, and it cannot be changed. That opposition to Jews was not about them believing the wrong thing. It was about being the wrong thing, being the wrong kind of person that couldn't be changed even if Jews converted. So there's no more a push for Jews to convert, because that, in their view, would not solve the problem. So anti-Semitism is based on these very particularly modern shifts in the way that groups of people are thought about. Yeah.
Thank you. Louis Padullo from Philadelphia. Isn't there sort of, in the evolution, a virtual Zionism whereby people can maintain dual citizenships, and you can live wherever you want and do whatever you want and maintain your associations, but you still have this foot in the other place. In fact, it's encouraged. You can go visit, you can work there, you can send your children there. That's what, for want of a better word, I was thinking of it as a virtual Zionism.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of putting it. I guess this gets back to the slide that I showed before, that Zionism ends up being two things that work in tandem but are actually distinct. One is a settlement project oriented towards creating a state, and the other, and this is what you're talking about, is Zionism being some way of asserting Jewish identity, of thinking about Jews not as a religion, or not only as a religion, but somehow as a national, unified national group. And that was and is, for many Jews, very influential. So yeah, you can think about it as virtual Zionism. It could be some sense of feeling connected, or it could, in some cases, involve donating money or going to visit. And all these things are happening among people who pretty much have no intention of moving, right? Like, they're doing okay, or they're fine with where they are, and yet for them, it's a marker of identity as a Jew.
Rachel, can we give it to the speaker of the room there in the middle row?
Nicole Duran from Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church, actually, which is my teaching context, which is maybe why I wonder if you could comment on the statement made earlier that there was Christian Zionism before there was Jewish Zionism.
Yeah, it's often called Christian Zionism. This is definitely not my area, so I'm probably not on the best terms talking about this, but Christian Zionism was based in part on the idea that Jews coming to Palestine might be a step towards the second coming of Christ. It's based connected to a certain philo-Semitism that is kind of the weird flip side of anti-Semitism, these very positive views about Jews. Christian Zionists often were actually interested in converting Jews to Christianity, so it's a little bit more complicated than just being pro-Jewish. Many of these Christian Zionists would set up missionary institutions in Jerusalem or elsewhere in Palestine under the Ottomans, and they were hoping that they would, find all these locals, and the locals would realize that actually Christianity was the right answer. They were not actually very successful in that, but they were very devoted to that project. I'm sorry that I can't tell you more, but I can probably give you some references if you want to read more about it for the church.
My name is Abdelmonem Said Ali. I teach at Brandeis University, and I enjoyed the presentation very much, but it seems to me it's a European thing. I mean, Zionism came out of the pogroms, of the Dreyfus Affair, of the Holocaust, of a series of events that you explained quite rightfully. But what's about the Oriental Jews? Jews were in Morocco, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Iraq, in Iran. So these are now, in our times, no less Zionists.
No less Zionists.
Than others. And they don't have in their history, living among Semites, basically, any of the elements that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's an important question. It's another topic that I didn't manage to talk about in this presentation, but it's a very important one. The early Zionists were not Mizrahi or Sephardi Jews. They simply weren't. Like the initial Zionists were Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern and Central Europe. Primarily Jews in the Arab and Muslim world were not Zionists. Some of them were actually doing fairly well compared to Jews in Europe. Felt like they could integrate, felt very culturally Arab, actually, in many cases. Over time, that changes, right? As Arab nationalism grows in the 1930s and 1940s, more of those Jews in Arab lands become Zionists, although by no means all of them. There's a mass migration of those Jews to the state of Israel in the 1950s and from Morocco in the 1960s. Many of those Jews come to be Zionists, or they come to, think of themselves as Zionists. They go through a transformation. It is certainly true that today, when I think about that virtual Zionism that you in the back so nicely defined it as, that is shared now by Jews from a variety of backgrounds, but that's a more recent development. That wouldn't be true to the way things were back in the year 1900 or so. I also should say that I should distinguish between political Zionism and a religious sense of the land of Israel being the homeland. That would have been something shared by Jews across the world. They would have prayed towards Jerusalem. They would have talked about the coming of the Messiah and the return of Jews to Jerusalem. But that is distinct from the movement of political Zionism that said that, in fact, Jews should start trying to establish an autonomous or independent state. So that might be an important thing to state.
There is a relatively new book by left-leaning Israeli journalist Ari Shavit that we were talking about last night, called My Promised Land. And interestingly, the reviews of it, there are some on the left who criticize it, and there are some on the left who praise it. There are some on the right who criticize it, and there are some on the right who praise it. But one of the points he makes very early on in the book, you address only slightly here, and I'm just wondering if you could elaborate when you were talking about the ways revisionist Zionists and labor Zionists viewed the Arabs. Because he says early in the book, when he's talking about his great-grandfather coming to Palestine in 1897 with the idea of moving his family from Britain to Palestine, that his great-grandfather didn't see the Arabs. So my question is really, to what extent the Zionists who came to Palestine saw or did not see the Arabs?
Well, just as early Zionists were Europeans in the sense that they were influenced by European political developments, they also were European in their way of thinking about people living in the Middle East. Thinking of them as less developed in terms of their civilization, thinking of them as simpler, less intelligent, backwards. These kinds of words, it's uncomfortable to say this, but this is how most Europeans thought about most people living in the Middle East. And Zionists sort of reflexively shared some of those views. They saw often Palestinian Arabs as part of the landscape, part of the natural terrain. Some of them saw them as almost maintaining the customs of the Bible. Oh, look at their primitive ways of cooking bread. That's probably how Abraham cooked bread. So there's some of this sense of almost trying to find the Jewish past in the Palestinian Arab present. Although it would be incorrect to say that they didn't see them, right? Like, they were there. They were there, and almost from the very beginning, from the first Aliyah period, we start to see conversation about, well, who are these people? Are we going to be on their good side? Are we going to be on their bad side? Is this going to be good for them? Is this going to be bad for them? So it didn't take long before these conversations really started happening in earnest.
Thanks. Patrick Tuart again from Virginia. While you were talking about it, I was thinking about my students whose knowledge of historic Jewish people is somewhat limited. I'm aware of figures like Einstein, Freud, maybe Kafka, Disraeli. These people are alive during this people who are famous Jewish people. But is there any record, primary or otherwise, of what these historic figures who were not associated with Zionism thought of Zionism, one way or the other?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't know if I can tell you offhand for everybody you mentioned.
Sure.
Kafka is a really interesting case because Kafka, he wanted his papers to be burned, but they weren't burned, and his colleague or friend Max Brod ended up keeping them, and then Israel wanted to claim them with the claim that Kafka would have wanted his papers to go to Israel, almost sort of adopting him as a Zionist of sorts. But it's actually very unclear where he stood, right? There are ways to look at him. He certainly wasn't part of the Zionist movement per se. So that's a particularly interesting case. There's actually a great article in the New York Times magazine from a few years ago about someone who kind of is tracking down the story of Kafka's papers. Freud, I mean, most of these people were assimilated Jews who very much supported the idea that Jews should be Germans or should be French or should be Austrian. But also some people's views changed over time. So I guess I can't really answer for everybody at once.
Thank you for Art Sear from Carthage College in Wisconsin. Thank you for an extremely enlightening and very disciplined presentation. I recall reading a fairly extensive commentary in the Economist magazine from the turn of the last century. I was reading in the library, not at the time, but early in the 20th century, it was very common to discuss Argentina as the United States of the Southern Hemisphere, a large Native American population, a large African and African American population. At the time, a great magnet for capital, robust industrial growth, very rich natural environment, remarkable similarities with the U.S., and it, to me, brought home just how important fascism and extreme protectionism were, even before the First World War, in countries that, to some extent, reflected British free trade. And the interplay between economics and politics was really significant. It was interesting that Argentina was mentioned.
Uh-huh. Okay, that was just a comment, no question. Thank you.
Oh, you've answered all the questions.
Okay.
Hi, Seth Friedlander again. So this is another sort of issues that we have in the classroom.
Yeah,
So
right,
when I have these industrious students and they hear the topic of Zionism and they go home that night and they go on Google and they go on Twitter and they're going to start reading articles, and most of them are going to be negative, and a lot of them are going to have PhD after them. And when they come into you the next day, I just read that Zionism is racism.
Mm-hmm.
How would you, where would you steer a intellectually curious 16-year-old?
I mean, my approach to this sort of thing is that it is interesting as a historical fact that people see Zionism as racism, right? Like, that is a phenomenon that is worth talking about. And in fact, there's a bigger discussion to have about all the different ways that people look at Zionism. Some people very positively, some people very negatively. They negative, but in different ways or for different reasons. So I think almost having the meta conversation, which is what are the different ways that people nowadays talk about Zionism, is a great way to think about all sorts of issues in contemporary politics. And then you can separate that conversation from, well, now let's look at the history of Zionism and think about what are its different stages and developments. I wouldn't just say like, oh, we're not talking about that. I think it's actually part of the conversation.
Hi, I'm Margaret Guerra from Philadelphia. I teach at Abington Friends. Mm-hmm. And we do actually a simulation around the Jewish state, so we're looking at that. And we have kids portray different perspectives. So like, somebody pretends to be Pinsker and somebody pretends to be Herzl, like that, cool. Right? Who would be some good voices or like little pieces of documents to represent liberal Jews who don't like the idea, or socialists?
Yeah, so there's a great book, a great source book called The Jew in the Modern World. It's now in its third edition. It's edited by Judah Reinhartz and Paul Mendez-Flor. It has sources on everything, and they're all really short, they're well edited. A lot of them are just a page or two long. There are examples of all of these groups. So I think in the packet that I sent around, there was a text from Orthodox anti-Zionists, but that collection also has stuff from socialists, from liberal Jews, really, really great sources. I use them in my college classes too.
Hi, I'm Sheila Seaver from Pius High School in Lincoln, Nebraska. We have a very agricultural background there, and I try and tie a lot of my lessons back to agriculture. So is one of the reasons why they had the Arabs work the land because they didn't know how, because of constant expulsions? They didn't have a tie to the land. They didn't know how, to operate a farm. I mean, was that part of it because they just didn't have the know-how?
Yeah, it's two reasons. It's that reason. They didn't know how. They assumed the locals who might have already been working the land would know how. And it was also because the Palestinian Arab local workers would take much lower wages. Jews were like, well, we deserve more. Like, we're not going to work for that, but they will. So sort of economically, it was a more efficient process. Very sort of in crude economic terms, that was also a motivation.
Brian Hussey, I teach here in Philadelphia. Question about sources as well, especially for that period from the 1920s to 1939, where people are moving for not necessarily, like as an ideal idea of Zionism, but they're moving for economic reasons or as refugees. Where is that debate taking place about what this movement means to them now, and how is that affecting, what the idea of Zionism is for them, and where can we find some good sources for the classroom for that?
So I'd again recommend this book, Jew in the Modern World. There's a whole section on Zionism. There's sections on all kinds of other things, also about the Enlightenment, some of these debates in Eastern and Western Europe you'll find there. There are texts from labor Zionist organizations, there are texts from revisionist organizations. I think there are texts in there from some immigrant groups. Like there were organizations, like Organization of German Immigrants to Palestine, where some of those perspectives are represented. For people who want to ask me, I may be able to think about other things if we have another conversation later.
Okay, I think we'll end at that point. So please join me in thanking Liora.